Καλησπέρα σας κυρίες και κύριοι. Είμαι η Bono Westcott, Διευθύντρια της Αμερικανικής Σχολής Κλασικών Σπουδών στην Αθήνα. Με μεγάλη μου χαρά σας καλωσορίζω εδώ απόψε, στην πρώτη μας διάλεξη της χρονιάς για την κλασική αρχαιολογία από την διακεκριμένη μελετήτρια και καθηγήτρια Catherine Keesling. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Bono Westcott, Director of the American School of Classical Studies at Athens, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here this evening to our first lecture of the year on classical archaeology by Catherine Keesling, one of our Whitehead Distinguished Scholars at the American School for the year 2022-23 and Professor of Classics at Georgetown University. Professor Keesling is the author of several books, including the Votive Statues of the Athenian Acropolis and Early Greek Portraiture, Monuments and Histories. And we are looking forward to The Epigraphic Habit, a volume co-edited with Rebecca Benefiel, and the Oxford Handbook of the Archaeology of Greek Sanctuaries, a Herculean task that she has undertaken solo. She is a much beloved teacher at Georgetown University, where in 2019 she won the Georgetown College Dean's Award for Excellence in Teaching. And this is one of the reasons why we are so very happy that she is a Whitehead Distinguished Scholar with us this year. Her research concerns the epigraphical evidence for ancient Greek sculpture, as well as the afterlives of archaic, classical, and Hellenistic monuments in later periods. This evening she will speak on exactly this, on the redisplay of Greek statues in newly crafted bases in Roman Greece, the reception of the late classical Athenian sculptors Praxiteles and Leochares, and the formation of sculptural collections in Greece and an early Roman period in a lecture entitled Old Statues on New Bases in Roman Athens. I welcome Professor Keesling.
Thank you so much, Bono. Let me just make sure everything is. So, is this volume going to be right?
Perfect.
Okay. It's a dream come true to be here as Whitehead, and it's an honor to be here in this wonderful hall with all of you present. So thank you for coming. Okay, I'm going to get right to it. I want to be as clear as possible at the outset about where this talk is headed. There are three parts. First, an overview of some forms of reuse of earlier Greek statues and their bases in the late Hellenistic and early Roman imperial periods, both in Roman Italy and in the Greek world. Second, an up-close look at three examples from Roman Athens in which I will argue that portrait statues from the 4th century BCE were being put on new bases for display in new contexts. And third, some brief thoughts on why this particular form of reuse happened, where in Athens the portraits might have been displayed, and why it all matters. I begin with this contemporary artwork by Theaster Gates because I love the way it forces us to think about the life cycle of public portrait statues. Gates imagines that we commission perfectly formed and finished classical pedestals and then wait for someone worthy of a statue to emerge and take his or her place on the top. Of course, the actual sequence of events is the inverse. The statue comes first, and the base is an afterthought. There are notable exceptions, but under most circumstances, bases were undecorated, improvised, and ultimately expendable. Something we don't normally think about is what happened when the statue was gone. Statues taken away as spoils of war, as objects for sale, or, in the case of some bronze statues, as scrap metal, traveled without their bases, which were left behind. I believe it was not at all the norm to leave empty statue bases standing in place for a long time. Here we see references by Pausanias to what was probably an exceptional situation. The defeat of the Achaean League by the Roman general Lucius Mummius in 146 BCE led to the removal of bronze statues from Megalopolis, Tegea, and other cities, and a full 300 years later, rows of despoiled bases were still there where Pausanias saw them. What happened in more ordinary situations? What happened when the local authorities who controlled civic spaces and sanctuaries wanted to move statues around for whatever reason? One solution was to put old statues on new bases. Old statues on new bases is as simple as it sounds, but in Greek epigraphy we haven't been looking for this particular form of reuse. Material reuse in all of its manifestations is having a moment in both Greek and Roman archaeology, and both the vocabulary and our understanding of the different forms of reuse have expanded in recent years. Not just reuse, but appropriation, upcycling, restaging, and reframing. Amid all of this activity, the collecting of Greek statues in Rome has received renewed attention, and in Rome we do have evidence for putting old Greek statues on new bases. The removal of Greek statues to Rome began with military plunder and evolved into an art market. The literary sources give the impression that the resulting collections of Greek statues were composed almost exclusively of images of gods and personifications, but we do have inscribed bases that show there were collections of Greek portraits as well. There are several sets of such bases. The set I show you here unfortunately no longer exists. I guess that's going to be a theme. What we see on the right is a facsimile of the inscribed texts based upon the transcription of the 17th century traveler Jacob Spon, who saw a set of matching statue bases for portraits of Greek subjects in the gardens of the Villa Mattei in Rome. Each of the 6 bases he recorded featured the name of the portrait subject and the signature of its sculptor. This lost set of Greek portrait statues raises questions. How do we know the statues were originals removed from the Greek world and not copies? In Roman context, the same repertoire of Greek male portraits tended to be copied over and over again: Athenian generals, Athenian orators, and philosophers. Well, here we do see an Athenian general, Timotheus, an orator, Hyperides, and a philosopher, Dion. We also have Iphitus, the supposed founder of the Olympic Games, and Phryne, the lover of the 4th century sculptor Praxiteles. But who was Lysis, the Milesian woman, and why would her portrait be copied? Instead of copies, I think what we see here is an eclectic assortment of portrait statues removed from somewhere in the Greek world and made into a gallery at an unknown date in an unknown context. Roman copies of Greek portraits usually didn't include sculptors' signatures, but Roman collections did. With the exception of Zeuxiades, these are all sculptors whose names we know, and their dates range from the mid-5th century BCE, that's Calamus, or maybe late 5th century, to the first half of the 3rd century BCE, Herodotus. We normally think of signatures as contemporary, carved onto the base by the sculptor himself when he made the statue, but they can also be retrospective, carved long after the sculptor's death, as seen here and in other examples from both the Roman West and the Greek East. Now, we do have a few matching sets of old statues on new bases from Greece and Asia Minor. In the Greek world, however, most scholarly attention has been devoted not to these collections, but instead to a different form of statue reuse: portrait reinscription, also called metagraphe or metagraphy. Some Greek portraits of the classical and Hellenistic periods, still standing in their original locations, had the names of new portrait subjects inscribed on their bases. This form of portrait re-identification through inscriptions was localized, and we see it practiced in some parts of the Greek world from the early 1st century BCE through the late 1st century CE. Perhaps the most striking example is this one from the Athenian Acropolis, as reconstructed by Ralph Krumijk. We have the base for an early classical striding, attacking figure in bronze, and we can infer from the inscribed epigram that the dedicator intended this warrior to be a portrait of his own father. That's a guess. But right below the epigram, same lettering, we also have a signature of Critias and Nesiotes, the sculptors who made the Tyrannicide statue in the Agora in 477 BCE. Almost 700 years later, in the Augustan or Tiberian period, the Athenians decided to honor a Roman consul, Lucius Cassius, by in effect re-identifying this statue as his portrait with a new inscription on the base. And you can see that it doesn't match very well, and it looks quite awkward. This example brings to the fore both the strangeness of portrait reinscription and the difficulty of figuring out why Greek communities under Roman rule were doing it. In modern scholarship, a negative, cynical view of the practice is grounded in our main literary source on portrait reuse, and this is the 31st oration by Dio Chrysostom, a speech delivered in Rhodes during the late 1st century CE. In this speech, Dio criticizes the people of Rhodes at length for putting the names of new subjects on older portraits as a form of flattery. Dio describes the Rhodian practice and claims the Rhodians were the only Greeks still doing this in his own time, and I think this is worth a dramatic reading. Whenever you vote a statue to anyone, and the idea of doing this comes to you now quite readily because you have an abundant supply of statues on hand, presto, there he stands on a pedestal, or rather, even before the vote is taken. But what occurs is quite absurd. Your chief magistrate, namely, merely points his finger at the first statue that meets his eyes of those which have already been dedicated, and then, after the inscription which was previously on it has been removed and another name engraved, the business of honoring is finished, and there you are. I think it's fair to say that Ralph Krumike and I and Julia Scheer and other scholars who have written recently on portrait reinscription take a more nuanced and a more positive view of the practice. For one thing, the fact that in the example I just showed you and in others, the original inscriptions were left in place to be read shows the practice wasn't meant to be deceptive. We'll come back around to Dio, but for our purposes right now, the important point is that the original sculptor's signatures were often left in place because they remained relevant and continued to attract interest no matter how the portrait was identified. So my goal in part 2 will be to redirect us away from portrait reinscription and toward different situations in Roman Athens, ones in which old portrait statues were put on new bases, I think. Okay, this is the silly part. If you're old enough, you may remember this ad from the 1980s. Okay, what you're about to see is your father's Oldsmobile, or maybe even your great-great-grandfather's Oldsmobile, in the sense that the material I'll be looking at here has been around for a long time. And so these are some of the 19th and 20th century scholars whose work I'm going to mention along the way. And as you know, epigraphists love corpora with acronyms. And here are some of the most important ones for this talk, including the DNO, essential reading for anyone who's interested in Greek sculptors and their works. Okay, in part 2, we're going to look at 3 bases for portrait statues with inscriptions that date to the 1st century BCE or the 1st century CE. The people named on them, however, seem to be Athenians of the 4th century BCE. 3 of these Athenians are portrait subjects, and 2 of them are sculptors. My first example is from the Athenian Agora. It was found built into the post-Herulian wall, where it runs down the Panathenaic Way alongside the city Eleusinion, where we can still see it today. The stone is dark blue Hymedian marble. The date we get from the letter forms is not very precise, but it's firmly in the Roman period, circa 50 BCE to circa 50 CE. And there we would be thinking about the pronounced serifs, alpha with broken crossbar, square sigma most of the time, and omega with V-shaped finials, which you can see very well there. So we have a 3-part Athenian citizen name: Lysanias, son of Nicodemus, of the deme Zipeti. And we should probably take this as a nominative name label for a portrait. This formula, which John Ma calls the great man nominative, was the norm for honorific portraits in Athens for centuries, but by the date of our inscription, we would expect instead an X-dedicated Y formula. For example, the Boulé and the Demos dedicated Lysanias, son of Nicodemus, of the deme Zipeti. So we already see a bit of a mismatch between the formula on the stone and what we would expect at this date. So who was this Lysanias? If we go to APF, we don't find him, but we do find multiple members of a wealthy family of the 4th century BCE that perform liturgies centered around a Nicodemus of Zipeti. We would have to leave it at that, were it not for Graham Oliver's work on his not yet published IG volume, collecting the Attic decrees of 321 through 301 BCE. He now restores the name Lysanias Nicodemu Zipetaion in a decree he dates to circa 330 to 320. So what we have here is either a 4th century individual named in a later inscription or a later individual with the same name. But there's no evidence other than this base for a Lysanias Nicodemu Tsipotaion in the Roman period. The name that attracts my attention is the sculptor Praxiteles. I'm sure you've heard of him, and you probably also have in mind a rough artistic biography. The career dates for Greek sculptors are always open to revision, but here I give you the dates from the DNO. If we look up Praxiteles on the internet, we invariably find a picture of the Hermes and Dionysus at Olympia. Its discovery in 1877 was such a sensation it touched off a series of bust replicas that continue to be produced today. But here we have a problem. The Hermes statue at Olympia is either an old statue on a new base, that the base it was found with is definitely late in date, or a new statue made in the Roman period. Was Pausanias right, or was he wrong? Another solution is to say that this statue is actually the work of a late Hellenistic or early Roman imperial sculptor, also named Praxiteles. This old idea has taken on new life as more attention is paid to signatures of Praxiteles that seem to date to the Roman period, including the one we've just looked at. If we suppose that this late Praxiteles was a descendant of the famous one, with the name recurring every other generation in the family, we end up with a sculptor called Praxiteles VI or Praxiteles VII. We want to be able to create biographies for Greek sculptors by putting together different types of evidence, but the signatures are more problematic than they first appear. To bring this point home, here I show you my, I hope, complete list of Praxiteles signatures on statue bases. As you can see, we have almost as many signatures in the second category as we have contemporary ones. That is, signatures that seem to date later than the 4th century when the famous Praxiteles lived and worked. Our base in the Agora is one of these. The other 3 at the bottom are all cases of portrait reinscription. Now, Krumike and I have a fundamental, though very friendly, disagreement about how to interpret these problem signatures. He argues that the signatures we see on these bases really do belong to a late Hellenistic sculptor named Praxiteles. Here, I'm not going to repeat the back and forth you can follow for yourselves in publications, but I do want to explain clearly why I still believe these last 4 signatures all refer to the famous 4th century Praxiteles I. First of all, Athenian sculptors in the 4th century signed their works in Athens with their name only, Praxiteles Apoiasen. But this was not true in the late Hellenistic period. The norm was to sign with the patronymic and or the demotic. Joint signatures were also common, and they reflect the familial organization of the Athenian sculpture industry at that time. Here we see Andrew Stewart's stemma for the Polycles family, one of these families of sculptors we know about in this period. And you can see how complicated this gets. We have 4 generations of Athenian sculptors working in Athens, Olympia, Delos, and Rome. But the important point is that they don't just sign with their name only, they sign with more. Now, the 4th century Praxiteles family was ahead of its time in that they did have a family workshop, and they kept it going across either 3 or 4 generations. But despite this, and despite the fact that Praxiteles and his sons were Athenian citizens, none of the known Praxiteles signatures includes a patronymic or a demotic. And we see a patronymic only once for Praxiteles' son, Kephisodotos. So there are several signatures by Kephisodotos and Timarchus, but only once do you actually have the patronymic there. So a name-only signature is exactly what we would expect for the 4th century Praxiteles. Also, to get to Praxiteles 6 or 7, we have to suppose that a descendant who is a sculptor suddenly pops up 200 years after the last known sculptor in the family. And why would that sculptor sign with his name only? So my idea is that a 4th century portrait of Lysanias made by Praxiteles was redisplayed at a later date by putting it on a new base and copying the name and the signature. Who took the initiative to do this and why, we simply don't know. This statue might have stood in the Agora, but given the location where we now see the base, it might also be a portrait from the city Eleusinion. The latter is an attractive possibility since the 4th century Praxiteles signed multiple portrait statues there, and I refer you to an excellent article by Sheila Dillon on just this subject. So, number 2. We don't need much time on number 2. And I'm sorry if this photo that I have to use here is a bit blurry. It's a single block of dark Eleusinian limestone, now in the Epigraphical Museum. Find spot unknown, and on the top are the footholds for a bronze statue. So here we have only a name label with no signature. The lettering is definitely late. I hope you can see that. Perhaps you can't. This base is the only evidence for a Roman period Athenian named Thrasilicus Kephisodoru Anagarasios, but there is quite a bit of evidence for a 4th century Athenian by that name. Thrasybulus and his brother Midias were both leading politicians and liturgists during what we might call the age of Demosthenes in Athens, from the mid-4th century through the death of Alexander. Commentators have long been puzzled to find Thrasybulus' name in a Roman period inscription. But if we accept that old statues were moved and placed on new bases, then we have a ready explanation for this example. What remains to discuss is why. Before we move on to number 3 and to the question of why, the stone used in number 2, Eleusinian limestone, deserves further comment. This is a distinctive material in Athenian architecture and epigraphy, and its uses were limited. Perhaps most familiar is its use for color contrast in the propylaea on the Acropolis. Some high classical cult statue bases in Athens also used Eleusinian limestone as a dark background behind human figures. Here we see the effect recreated in the Nashville Parthenon and in Stephen's reconstruction of the cult statues in the Hephaestion. Ordinary statue bases of the late 6th century, the 5th century, and the 4th century also made use of it, but only in a limited way. Sometimes the top block where the statue stood was Eleusinian limestone, but almost invariably the inscription was carved on another element made of white Pentelic marble, as we see here. In the frieze of the Erechtheion, Eleusinian limestone was used as a background for human figures in Pentelic, no longer in place. When the building needed to be repaired after a fire, old Eleusinian statue bases with footholds were reused in the repairs. Starting in the 1st century BCE, and especially in the Augustan period, we suddenly see Eleusinian limestone being used for the inscribed parts of statue bases. I don't have exact numbers yet, but if you go through the IG, this development is quite striking, and it makes me think that Thrasybulus base should be dated to the Augustan period. Did interest in the Periclean buildings of the Acropolis, and maybe even engagement in the repairs to the Erechtheion, remind Athenian architects and sculptors of this material? Possibly. But we can also think more broadly about the Roman taste for colored stones reaching Greece in this period. So base number 3 is my most important example, but as luck would have it, this one is now lost, so another thing that no longer exists. It was recorded by Ludwig Ross near the Lysicrides monument on the Street of Tripods, a location that will turn out to be important. So Eubulus Spintherou Propolisios was one of the most important political figures of the mid-4th century in Athens. Our own Edward Harris, who can't be here tonight, wrote the entry on him in the Encyclopedia of Ancient History. Eubulus is mentioned in 4 different speeches by Demosthenes. His career as a public servant extended into the so-called Lycurgan era from 338 to 323, though we don't know how or when he died. Once again, the only evidence for a later individual by the same name is this lost statue base. As we see here, Ross didn't have much to say about Eubulus, but thought that, given the date of the inscription, the signature must refer not to the 4th century Leochares, but a later sculptor with the same name. Ross's own editor, M.E.H. Meyer, here at the bottom, added a footnote disagreeing with him. So from the beginning, people argued about this question. We seem to see 4th century people mentioned here, but the inscription has to be Roman period. What do we do with this? I try to go shopping, and I keep seeing these sculptors everywhere. If you look up Leochares on the internet, this head from the Acropolis is one of the things you'll find. Leochares did make at least one portrait of Alexander, and he did work on the Acropolis, but this particular attribution to Leochares results from a chain of associations I won't go into here, since I'm more interested in complications arising from signatures. For Leochares, we have 8 normal signatures, all with his name only, and no evidence of family connections. We also have 4 problem signatures, including the one we just looked at. Okay, so I'm not showing you the 8 normal signatures. Here are the problem ones. And don't worry, I'm not going to go in detail into each of them. But I think you can see how the kind of inquiry I'm pursuing here snowballs, right? Because if I look at the first one and say, oh, well, this must be the 4th century Leochares with his name inscribed on a later base, well, then we also have 3 other things that seem to be late signatures by a sculptor of this name. So if I argue that there wasn't a later Leochares, I ultimately need to address all 4 of the signatures listed here. But what if there was a Roman period sculptor named Leochares who signed the 2 statue bases in Rhodes, but maybe not the 2 in Athens? I've given a lot of thought to this question. In reference to number 2 from Athens, I would point out that the name-only signature there is still an anomaly. In reference to number 3 from Rhodes, the problem is that there are no other signatures of Athenian sculptors on Rhodes from the 1st century BCE. There aren't any from the 2nd century BCE either, so there are just a very few signatures of Athenian sculptors on Rhodes in the classical period, a couple in the 3rd century, and then there aren't any others after that except for these ones with this name Leochares. So the Leochares Athenaios, Leochares the Athenian, on Rhodes at this late date is also an anomaly. Numbers 2 and 4 are both portraits. We know that the Athenians of the Roman period had no problem re-identifying old portraits as new subjects through reinscription. What we need to consider further is whether we think some old portrait statues were being put onto new bases and re-identified as someone else at the same time. So that's going a bit farther than people have been willing to go. If this seems too conspiratorial, consider this. I've already mentioned Dio Chrysostom's speech against the Rhodians. The thing that's always puzzled me, though, is the disconnect between Dio's speech and the archaeological evidence. Dio claims the Rhodians were re-identifying portraits right and left for a long time, but we don't have any examples of portrait reinscription at all from Rhodestown or from Lindos, where there were hundreds of portraits. Now I wonder if Dio was really talking not only about reinscription, but also about a more deceptive practice in which old statues were put on new bases and presented as portraits of different subjects. So I'm giving you that as something to think about. The jury is still out on this, but my thought on the 3 bases in Athens is still that these would be cases of old statues from the 4th century being put on new bases. So at this point, I want to go back to Athens and to some consequences if we accept that the 3 4th century portraits we looked at were put on new bases in the Roman period. First consequence, more original works in Athens by Praxiteles and Leochares. Praxiteles and Leochares were the 2 sculptors most closely associated with 4th century Athens by the Romans. Works of both sculptors featured prominently in Roman public collections of Greek originals. And so we see there's a whole series of these statue bases from the Forum Pacis in Rome. The lettering is very late because these are post-fire replacements from, I seem to remember it's the early 3rd century CE. So here we see a work of Leochares popping up in another one of these Roman collections. Pliny the Elder showed a particular interest in these sculptors of the late classical period. Roman interest might have been enough to motivate the Athenians to find and rehabilitate the surviving works of Praxiteles and Leochares in their home city. More evidence for their works could be hiding in plain sight in the form of problem signatures. More evidence for awards of highest honors, megistai timai, including an honorific portrait to Athenian citizens in 4th century Athens. So that would be a potential consequence if we accept my line of reasoning here. My 3 bases are potential new examples of officially awarded honorific portraits. But how common were awards of portrait statues in 4th century Athens? The known Athenian recipients of highest honors, including a portrait statue, in the period highlighted here, fall neatly into two groups. The first 5 honorands, in the first half of the 4th century, are mentioned over and over again in our sources, and it's clear that the motive was military victory. For the second group, also consisting of Athenian citizens, Stephen Lambert has recently offered a compelling explanation. The third quarter of the 4th century was a period of intense political conflict in Athens and outside pressure from Philip II and Alexander. Athens needed to encourage its own citizens to undertake public service above and beyond the requirements of the democratic system. Honors for Athenian citizens, publicized and awarded on a scale not heard of before, were the carrot. In this context, it would not be at all surprising if this second group of honorands were really bigger than we know, and that politically active Athenians, such as Thrasybulus and Eubulus, were awarded highest honors. The evidence for more 4th century honorific portraits in Athens could also be hiding in plain sight. But finally, why were the Thrasybulus and Eubulus portraits moved? And where in Athens were they displayed in the Roman period? What follows is one hypothesis. Putting old statues on new bases can imply not just rehabilitation, but also a compelling reason to move the statues from one place to another. Incorporating them into a portrait collection, something like the one in Rome I discussed at the beginning of this talk, is the reason that springs to mind. In light of the find spot Ross reported for the Eubulus base near the Lysicrides monument, I'd like to consider the Prytanean as a display place for a possible display place for my bases 2 and 3. The Prytanean, the common hearth where the Athenians offered public hospitality to honored guests, is the great undiscovered building in the ancient city of Athens. I certainly haven't discovered it myself, but I can show you here what we know about its location. 2 passages in Pausanias give us parameters. In light of these parameters, some of the locations proposed in recent scholarship appear here in blue circles, and I realize this is a bit inadequate, and my blue circles may not be big enough, but we see here, sort of just off of the street grid, Jeffrey Schmaltz, who was actually a regular member with me at the American School, published an article in Hesperia in 2006, arguing that the square around Agia Ekaterini Church, right there, would be a possible location for the Prytanean. Most people, I think, have reached the conclusion that that doesn't quite fit the parameters as well as some other possible locations do. So the dot just up from that we see is on modern Othos Thespidos, where excavations have revealed quite a lot of building activity. There might be a monumental building there. And then we go a bit farther up. There are several locations a bit farther up where we might also want to imagine the Prytanean being. So, of course, the street that's running through there is Tripod Street, today Othos Thripodon. And the black dots you see are the Lysicrides monument and the other Choregic monuments. And I should point out that many of these monumental Choregic monuments, including the Lysicrides monument, do date from this same period in the 4th century that we're talking about here. Okay, so thanks to excavations along Tripod Street, we now have a lot more Choregic monuments, and like the Lysicrides monuments seen here, they also date to the Lycurgan period. We do know something about a collection of portrait statues inside the Prytanean, even without identifying a site for the building. So our starting point is Pausanias' description of statues he saw inside the Prytanean in the 2nd century CE, supplemented here with another reference from the Life of the 10 Orators by Pseudo-Plutarch. Okay, I might as well read these. So first, Pausanias, nearby is the Prytanean, in which the laws of Solon are inscribed, and there are situated statues of the goddesses Irene and Hestia, and other statues in addition to Autolycus the Pancratiast. They have reinscribed the portraits of Miltiades and Themistocles as a Roman and a Thracian. And later we get a story about Autolycus. Olympiodorus This reference is what Pausanias says is that Olympiodorus has not only honors at Athens, both on the Acropolis and in the Prytaneum, but also a painted portrait at Eleusis. And then here, I'll read this in more detail. There's a portrait of Demosthenes' nephew, Demochares, in the Prytaneum, first on the right going toward the hearth. Again, for Demochares, Laches, his son, requested honors in the archonship of, and we get 271, involving the erection of a portrait in the Agora and Cytisus, free meals in the Prytaneum for him and the eldest of his descendants forever. The portrait of Demochares was moved to the Prytaneum. So what's curious there is that we have a description of this honorific portrait of Demochares being set up in the Agora in 271, and then later, before the time of this author, it was moved into the Prytaneum. So it's important to recognize that Pausanias was selective, especially in the first passage. There are other statues, in addition to the ones I choose to mention. So he leaves out other statues and chooses to mention Autolycus, a fighter against Athenian tyranny, Miltiades and Themistocles, fighters against Persian tyranny, and Olympiodorus, a fighter against Macedonian tyranny. To be clear, this is a portrait collection. The honorific portrait of the 4th century politician Demochares was moved from the Agora into the Prytaneum. The right to free meals in the Prytaneum, Cytisus, was a standard honor in Athens, but the Prytaneum was not a venue for awarding honorific portraits, unlike the Agora, the Acropolis, and the Theater of Dionysus. The only evidence for decrees awarding portraits in the Prytaneum dates to the 3rd century CE. Okay, so the Prytaneum doesn't occur in literary sources or in decrees as a place to set up portraits until the 3rd century CE. This absence of award of portrait statues in the Prytaneum adds weight to the idea that portraits were being moved there from elsewhere in Athens. But when were the portrait statues moved into the Prytaneum? The mention of moving Demochares' portrait from the Agora to the Prytaneum strongly suggests the collection there dates after the early Hellenistic period. A case can be made for the early imperial period. Now, key to this case are the portraits of Miltiades and Themistocles, which Pausanias says were reinscribed as a Roman and a Thracian. This is one of the very few instances in which Pausanias mentions portrait reinscription, and to make sense of it, we need to go back to a conjecture by Louis Robert, which has stood the test of time. And I know this sounds very convoluted, but this is an idea that seems to work. So in the Augustan period, a Roman citizen from Syria named Gaius Julius Nicanor was honored elsewhere by the Athenians as the new Themistocles for helping Athens regain control of Salamis. Given the association between Miltiades' family and Thrace, Robert argued that Miltiades' portrait was reinscribed in honor of the Thracian king Rhoemetalces III. The reinscription of Themistocles and Miltiades, in fact, might have happened at the same time all the portraits were assembled inside the Prytaneum, or at least that's food for thought, some evidence for us to think about when this collection of portraits might have been assembled. Could the portraits of Thrasybulus and Eubulus have been part of this collection? I've already noted that the use of Eleusinian limestone for their bases would fit well in the Augustan period. Another issue is just how much thematic coherence the portraits in the Prytaneum had. Was this a collection tightly focused on fighters against tyranny, or was there room for surviving statues of other patriotic Athenian citizens of the 4th century? Sculptors might have mattered too. Was there a particular interest in the works of Leochares? Perhaps. So here I hope to have opened up one window onto a bigger picture, in which local communities in Roman Greece took an active role in curating their own history in the form of portrait statues. To the growing vocabulary for reuse, I would like to add curation and rehabilitation. To find more evidence, we need to look carefully at statue bases and at sculptors' signatures, and we need to be on the alert for anomalies and coincidences. So I've tried to give you a lot of questions to think about, maybe too many, and I very much welcome your thoughts. Thank you.
turn first to the audience and open the floor for questions. Professor Spaeth never fails us.
Thank you for a really interesting talk. Oh, sorry. Thank you for a really interesting talk. I'm curious if there's any possibility that some of these portraits being ascribed to really famous sculptors is not true.
Yeah.
That they're put up and, oh, well, look, here's a portrait by, Phidias or something. You just think of things that people would like to have, and maybe that's why they're there.
Yes. This is definitely, thank you, Barbette, this is definitely something to think about. In looking at a lot of these signatures from a lot of different places, there are some examples in which you've got a statue base from, the 4th century BCE or the 3rd century BCE, and then in later lettering, somebody has added a sculptor's signature on it, so that's a slightly different situation. There's one of these from Rhodes that I'm thinking about, and in that situation, you certainly consider the possibility, well, is this a remembered fact about the statue, or are they just making it up? I mean, you work in Rome, and so, certainly in Rome, there are a lot of these, what I call retrospective signatures. These are attributions that just seem to come out of nowhere, and they're put there on basis in collections in Rome. But in thinking about Athens, could they allow themselves to do that? Without some evidence to connect these famous sculptors who were Athenians after all with these statues, could they just be making it up? I would hesitate to go there, but I am alert to this possibility since we see this so much in Rome. So thank you for bringing that up.
I have a question in the back, and it's a little bit shady, so I'm not quite sure who it is. Okay, all right, first,
Oh, sorry.
Jessica, and then...
Thank you so much for that. That was wonderful. I was wondering if you could speak to this idea of perhaps the people in the Roman period trying to create like a visual connection to the past and this idea of memory. Because like with the statues that Pausanias was talking about in the Prytaneion, like clearly he's still recognizing them as Miltiades and Themistocles. So there's not an erasure of that portraiture, but perhaps a connection with the new people in that past.
Yeah, thanks, Jessica. So I did spend time here explaining this whole portrait reinscription thing because we've been studying this for some time, and it itself raises lots of questions about memory and shaping memory. And so we noticed on that example I showed you early on, they're not erasing who dedicated that portrait, right? We do have other examples in Athens in which the original inscriptions are not erased. They're just adding a new portrait identity, and so it would seem viewers would have to put the two together. Viewers are not being asked to forget what this was. They're maybe even being reminded of who this portrait represented by seeing the new inscription put on there, right? The new inscription would attract your eye. There's something freshly carved there, and then you would look further and you would see, oh yes, this is an historic statue. I think it's hard for us to imagine doing this, right? But this is the norm. In some places, the Athenian Acropolis, we have this done. It's not done everywhere. Dio, in the speech, says they're doing this a lot in Rhodes. I think we have to accept this as a real form of honor. I think communities such as the Athenians can't mean this in a purely cynical fashion, or the Rhodians, because then the recipients would know this was entirely cynical, and it really wouldn't fit in the way people are thinking about honor and why honor matters. So I think there's a desire to rehabilitate the past, to remember the past, and this modality of reinscription is helping communities do it. This old statues on new bases thing that I think we have, would certainly also be contributing to memory, maybe of statues that are in a place where they're forgotten, people that have not been remembered as much as they should have been, and putting this on a new base with a nice fresh inscription would be a way of remembering. So I see that as fostering memory too. I see both of these forms of reuse as really fostering memory and rehabilitating aspects of the past and bring them up to the fore.
Thanks so much for the talk. Do you have any thoughts on rehabilitating statue bases and statues for the purposes of making fictional kinship ties? So you want to be affiliated with this famous 4th century Athenian because it gets you free meals at the Prytaneon. So you rehabilitate that statue to substantiate that claim. Like in Plutarch, we see at the end of the Lives, Plutarch will make the comment, this family is still alive today. Like Themistocles' great-great-great-granddaughter is around. And so maybe she's taking care of this statue to substantiate, or rehabilitating a statue to substantiate her claim to elite tradition.
Okay, yeah, the sound was a little bit mushy in there, but I want to make sure. I think in the end I understand what you're saying. In this, in the 1st century BCE, 1st century CE, we suddenly find Athenians in inscriptions of various kinds claiming to be descended from important Athenians such as Pericles, Themistocles, yes, and others. So, I mean, not in their cases, not in the case of Miltiades and Themistocles, but people who received honors, ancestors who received honors, there's always a motive to keep memory of that alive because, in theory, these honors, such as Cytisus and the Prytaneon, continue forever through all the generations, and there's a desire to refresh the memory of it. I mean, so I'm not sure I've totally understood your comment, Luke, but I think we have to have a public initiative here. I mean, reinscription is done by the Boulé and the Demos, usually. Here, I think we must have a public initiative to reinscribe these Miltiades and Themistocles portraits and to gather these other portraits here, no matter how many of them were gathered. Did I miss something?
No, only the fact that there might be a possibility that there is no relationship at all. But, fraud, basically, the possibility of fraud.
I think I'm still missing something. But we can talk about it.
Thank you, Kathy. Do you think perhaps adding the name of a later person underneath, as we saw in that, could be seen as a form of heroization for the later person? Because, the appearance of the original hero by that time, of course, would be like transferred to the more recent one?
I think some of these cases of reinscription would certainly involve heroic overtones. And of course, in this period that we're talking about, 1st century BCE, 1st century CE, heroization becomes a much more widespread thing. Families are heroizing their own members. Monuments to heroized families at places like Messene in the Peloponnese. So I think heroic overtones. And I always want to make a distinction between being heroic and being a hero, since technically to be a hero you have to be receiving sacrifices. But being heroic is something that's tremendously important in Greek culture, I think, throughout. And certainly the Roman and the Thracian here would be extremely flattered by a comparison between themselves and Themistocles and Miltiades, who by this point would be considered heroes.
Thank you, Kathy, for that very interesting and stimulating talk. This is just an observation stimulated by your slide here. What's quite interesting about this collection in the Prytaneon is that it has one statue which for sure was voted by the demos for Megastytimai, and that's the Demochares statue.
Yeah.
The Olympiodorus one, which many scholars have thought was in that category, and then two statues which certainly were not similar in that sense, that the Olympiodorus statue thought to have been more or less contemporary with Olympiodorus himself. The Demochares is shortly after his death. But the Miltiades and the Themistocles statues are going to be quite different beasts.
And Autolycus
the
as well.
Autolycus one I
Potentially.
don't have very strong feelings on. I have more strong feelings about Autolycus and the 30, but not on the statue. And that's what makes this a rather curious collection from my perspective.
Yeah, I agree. And most people think that, in the time of Miltiades and Themistocles, I still believe portraits were not very common. So we should probably think, we know in the 4th century there are lots of retrospective portraits of Miltiades and Themistocles, so these could be 4th century portraits of them, but where were they originally? Were they originally in the Prytaneon? I guess it's possible. Might they have come from anywhere? We really don't know. But yeah, it is a mixed bag. Autolycus is an interesting case because he's clearly a 5th century figure, but then if Pliny is right, and we never know if he is, Leochares, our much later sculptor, our somewhat later sculptor made that. And again, what would have motivated that? We're not sure. So thank you. We'll get to you too, Emily.
Yes.
Thanks so much for that. Another question prompted by just reading this slide is how Pausanias is viewing this, and it's obviously this is a translation, but the fact he's given the names of the original inscription, but this somewhat dismissive Roman and Thracian. So do we have any other hints as to how in the Roman period, that after this has happened, they're seeing these reinscriptions?
Yeah, that does sound a bit dismissive, doesn't it? And the translation captures that, I think, the dismissive tone, a Roman and a Thracian. And then if we believe the conjecture, one of them is actually a king of Thrace, and the other one is this Roman citizen who's a massive benefactor. So Pausanias just only a couple of times mentions cases of reinscription and just mentions them very quickly in passing in an almost dismissive tone. So he could be certainly seeing more of it and just ignoring it and not wanting to mention it because Pausanias' work is about all things Greek, and potentially we have Romans and others being named here in these new inscriptions, and he doesn't want to sully the picture by mentioning that.
A question down here in the front with Emily.
Hello? Okay. I'm not sure how much evidence there is for this, but I can think of maybe one example from your talk. I'm curious about to what extent we should imagine the statues themselves were modified for the new bases, and what we know about these Roman collections, and to what extent they would have been sort of refurbishing the statues for their new context.
Sorry, I didn't quite hear the beginning. I think there's some feedback between my microphone and your microphone. So I think you have to repeat what you said, Emily.
I'm curious about how they modified or may have modified the statues for the new bases, and how much evidence there actually is for that.
So I thought that was what you said. Okay, well, portrait reinscription is the phenomenon that's been studied quite extensively, and there's one school of thought, how could you how could you put these new names? I mean, especially the 5th century statue we looked at, how could you put a name of a Roman consul there without modifying the statue? Perhaps for later portraits like Miltiades and Themistocles, wouldn't you have to change the head, change the face of it? So there's one school of thought that it would have been the norm in portrait reinscription to modify the statue, and perhaps even if it's a bronze statue, as it probably would be, change the face. I hesitate there and think that was probably not being done because Dio Chrysostom gives this long speech criticizing the Rhodians for doing this and just laying it on very, very thick, but he never mentions changing the statues, right? I mean, he's trying to accuse the Rhodians of doing every bad thing in the book when they re-identify these portraits, but he doesn't actually mention changing the statue. I think if that were a common practice, he would have gone to town mentioning, oh, and you have this portrait of someone here, and you rip the head off and you put this other head on it, but he doesn't say anything like that. And so I don't actually think they were changing the statues.
We do have a question online, so let me catch that and then return to Barbette. And then I have actually one I'd love to ask myself. But this one comes from Nigel Kendall, and I should let everybody know there's about 25 people who are tuning in through Zoom. Thank you, Kathy, for this stimulating talk. A question that comes to mind is who reinscribed the statues? You've just stated that at Athens, the boule/demos must be responsible, but at Rhodes, there is a long decree of 22 CE from Lindos, Lindos 2:419, in which the right to inscribe uninscribed bases on the steps and on the height is sold off to whoever can pay. This opens up the possibility that private individuals might be responsible. What do you think?
Thanks, Nigel. You mentioned a decree from Lindos that I think about a lot. There's a good article about this called Statues at Auction, and now I'm suddenly blanking on who wrote it. But that situation is, the more I look at it, the more complicated I think it is, because what the decree, so it's 22 CE, and the Lindian government basically decides to auction off the right to inscribe something on some of their portraits. But what they literally say in the decree is that they're going to allow people to dedicate them to the gods. So is that just covering up the practice of putting new names on portraits? Or do they actually, I mean, is it a sort of jolly charity auction in which they're going to raise money from people who are willing to go to old statue bases and just inscribe a dedication to the gods and give the city money without getting a portrait in return? The more I think about it, the more I'm kind of concerned that maybe this is not portrait reinscription that's described in that decree, but it certainly requires further thought, and at some point I would like to know what Nigel thinks about it.
Thank you. I'll let you know if he types an answer. But in the meantime, we'll turn to Barbette.
Kathy, to go back to Roman parallels for this stuff, when I was thinking about the whole question of whether they would recut the face of somebody, it occurred to me that that is sort of like damnatio memoriae at that point. You're getting rid of the person who was there before if you recut it. Whereas this, it seems more like the inscriptions that talk about, I don't know, Sabina as the new Demeter at Eleusis. It's holding the two in your mind at the same time, not obliterating one to replace it with another.
Exactly. You said that better than I did. Thank you. Holding the two in mind at the same time. I agree.
And one thing that struck me is that the statues, it's not a likeness, but it's an honor. And you're really tapping into the honor as opposed to the likeness. And so there's no need to change the image. That's just a thought from a non-expert. But I was also really quite interested in your dating of the Eleusinian limestone, the use of Eleusinian limestone for bases, because I guess I've been struck by the use of dark stones of different varieties for bases that does go back earlier. And I wondered if there was really something specific just about Eleusinian limestone, or if in fact there is other, these other stones are different from it, and it does not appear until.
Well, yeah, I mean, this, we have to qualify this a lot, because we do have Eleusinian limestone being used in a lot of statue bases. I showed you the Conon and Timotheus from the Acropolis, but they tend not to want to inscribe the text on it. We do have a few examples of text inscribed in late 6th century and in 5th century of text inscribed on the dark Eleusinian stone, but certainly in the 5th century, the norm becomes to put the inscription on Pentelic. In the Hellenistic period, Hymedian is going to become the norm, right? And it can be lightish color Hymedian, it can be dark blue like my first, right? But I just think that Eleusinian limestone, just in architecture, it has such a particular use in Athenian architecture, and in bases it seems to be used very deliberately. But then you go through all those honorific bases, and suddenly 1st century BCE and then into Augustine, you suddenly see it with all sorts of inscriptions on it, which is just not the preferred way of doing the inscription before. And so that's why I think there's something to it, but I'm still working on it.
Okay, thank you. That was very helpful clarification. Do we have other questions? And no from online, so I'd like to invite you again to thank our speaker and join us for a reception just outside.
Thank you.